Next, it's a Senate Governmental Affairs Committee hearing on terrorism. The committee met yesterday to look into the threat of terrorism in the wake of the Persian Gulf War and to discuss the possible sponsors of terrorism against the United States. Committee members heard testimony from a number of experts on terrorism from the State Department and the Defense Department, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The hearing was chaired by Democratic Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut, who has organized previous hearings on U.S. anti-terrorism programs.
The hearing will come to order. Good morning. Almost 2 years ago, in September of 1989, in the exercise of this committee's jurisdiction over interagency cooperation, particularly in the area of national security, the Committee on Governmental Affairs held a hearing on the effectiveness of our nation's domestic and international counterterrorism efforts, and we attempted there to assess the nature of past and future terrorist threats. I was very grateful that Senator John Glenn of Ohio, chairman of the committee, authorized me to chair that hearing, which actually was the first that I had chaired as a member of the United States Senate. At that hearing, I recall saying that the most serious threats to our security may no longer come from Soviet attack, particularly Soviet nuclear attack, but instead from assaults by renegade nations and from terrorists. 11 months later, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Since that 1989 hearing, we've obviously also witnessed what can only be described as phenomenal changes in the political map of the world. Soviet domination and autocracy in Eastern and Central Europe have been replaced by emerging democracies. The Berlin Wall has tumbled, and Germany once again stands united. The Soviet Union itself is preoccupied with its own internal political and economic problems. And an unprecedented coalition of nations succeeded in defeating Saddam's army and diminishing Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. It seemed to us then that the time has come for a new assessment, a fresh assessment before this committee of the state of terrorism in the world. I want to again thank Senator Glenn for authorizing me to chair this hearing to begin this new assessment. Now, the Gulf War has obviously changed attitudes and alliances in the Middle East. The United States and Western Europe joined with Saudi Arabia, Syria, Egypt, and other Arab and Muslim nations to fight Iraq's aggression. These changes may well have had and will continue to have an impact on terrorist actions emanating from that troubled region. But what that impact will be remains to be seen. There are both encouraging and discouraging signs. During the Gulf War, there was a notable lack of widespread terrorist incidents against United States citizens and targets. Now, that may demonstrate that international cooperation is a truly effective weapon against terrorism. It may indicate that our own anti-terrorism efforts have improved significantly. It may mean that some of our Gulf War allies have the ability to influence the course and extent of terrorism more than they have previously known or perhaps been willing to admit. Or the small number of attacks may simply mean that we overstated Saddam Hussein's terrorist capabilities. These are the questions that I want to explore with our witnesses today. Those and other theories as to why American targets were relatively free from terrorist attack during the Gulf War. Now, as successful as past anti-terrorist efforts have been, we obviously have to look also to the future terrorist threat. Sadly, experience teaches that terrorists may strike out in revenge long after the events that they seek to avenge. There's been speculation by some experts that Saddam Hussein may be planning revenge attacks, for instance, once the oil embargo has been eased. Saddam has, through the years, allowed terrorists to operate out of Iraq. And Iraq is once again on our government's list of nations that sponsor terrorism. Baghdad reportedly has now become home to a variety of groups with a history of terrorist actions, including members of Abu Abbas's Palestine Liberation Front and the Arab Liberation Front. The PLF is thought to be responsible for the Achille Lauro hijacking and the May 1990 attack on an Israeli beach. Reports that the Abu Nidal organization, which is responsible for attacks at the Rome, Italy, and Vienna, Austria airports in 1985 and is suspected of assassinating PLO leaders in Tunisia earlier this year, has renewed contacts with Baghdad for the first time since expulsion from Iraq in 1983. And the master bomb builder, Abu Ibrahim, is now apparently living in Iraq, all of which heightens our concerns. Saddam Hussein's efforts to maintain control over nuclear materials, much reported in recent days, and his efforts to continue to obtain nuclear weapons, is yet more proof of his desire to sustain his ability to blackmail the world community, which heightens our concern about his role as a sponsor of world terrorism. There is, however, some reason also to be somewhat optimistic or hopeful. In the wake of the Gulf War, there are preliminary but nonetheless hopeful signs from other nations that have sponsored terrorist acts in the past. Syria, for example, was, of course, part of the multinational coalition that defended and liberated Kuwait. It is claimed that it wants closer ties with the United States. Just this morning, the newspapers tell us that President Assad has indicated what appears to be acceptance of the American plan for starting the Middle East peace process. Prime Minister Rafsanjani of Iran says that he is interested in Western investment and plans to make his first visit to a Western country when he meets with French President Mitterrand. Libyan leader Gaddafi has renewed relations with Egypt, has begun what some have called a charm offensive, and claims that he no longer sponsors terrorism. But of course it remains to be seen by acts whether there is any substance to these professed changes among those states that have previously sponsored terrorist actions. Serious questions will remain about Syria's policies as long as Ahmed Jabril's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command has its headquarters in Damascus. Jabril, as is well known, has been linked to attacks on international airlines and against the American troop train in Germany. Similarly, significant questions remain about Iranian involvement in the bombing of Pan Am 103 and the continuing holding of U.S. and other hostages in Lebanon by Lebanese Shiites who have ties with Tehran. In the case of Libya, Abu Nidal is still headquartered there, and evidence has emerged over the year that Libya may also have been involved centrally in the Pan Am 103 tragedy. The potential Iraqi terrorist threats and these continued doubts about Syria, Iran, and Libya raise important additional questions about the current state of international cooperation against terrorism. If an Iraqi terrorist were to attack an American target abroad in the near future, how difficult would it be to extradite the terrorist to and prosecute him in the United States? And if the terrorist were not extradited, how difficult would it be to gain a conviction abroad? Has international cooperation improved regarding the identification of the purchases of Semtex-type explosives of the sort that were used to destroy Pan Am 103? If, for example, Saddam Hussein were to use these kinds of explosives, could we trace them back to Iraq? The threat of Iraqi terrorism and continued doubts about other nations raises additional questions about our own preparedness. To what degree, for instance, is there a danger of terrorists resorting to more sophisticated and lethal technology? What kinds of devices might they use? How well are we prepared for such an eventuality? If, for example, a major chemical weapons terrorist incident occurred in the United States, which agencies would be responsible for managing the aftermath of such an attack and preventing loss of life and limb? This morning, I'm pleased to say that we are fortunate to have a group of widely respected authorities on terrorism here to address these very important questions. On the first panel, we'll hear from Acting Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the State Department, Ken Berquist, Chief of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Counterterrorism Section, Neil Gallagher, and the Associate Director of State and Local Program Support at the Federal Emergency Management Administration, Grant C. Peterson. Next, we will hear on the second panel from former Ambassador Gerald Bremer and former Special Assistant for Planning at the Defense Department, Noel Koch, who will provide an overview of current and future terrorist threats. And finally, former Department of Justice prosecutors Victoria Tensing and Kurt Muhlenberg will share their experiences and views regarding the legal and political challenges of bringing international terrorists to justice, including the particular difficulties surrounding the extradition process. I again, this time in his presence, want to thank and express my appreciation to the chairman of this committee, Senator John Glenn, for all that he has done in directing the oversight functions of this committee, in this case particularly regarding terrorism, and in authorizing me to hold this hearing. And I welcome Senator Glenn at this time.
Another aspect I also believe is that there were coalition partners who had influence over terrorist organizations. Syria, for example, which we believe attempted to use that degree of influence on its patrons to stay out of the fray. Also, I believe Iran used its influence to an extent because I believe they saw it in their interest to stay on the sidelines while this event occurred.
Recently, as I'm sure you know, ABC News aired a report in which they claimed that one of the other factors which explained why there weren't more terrorist episodes was that the Saudis essentially paid some of the terrorists not to commit acts of terrorism during the Persian Gulf War. Do you have any evidence to indicate that that was so?
I've heard that as a rumor, but I have no evidence whatsoever that occurred or did not occur.
I'm going to have some other questions. I'm going to stop here and yield to my chairman.
Thank you. Thank you very much. One area where terrorism against the United States has been very successful has been with the hostages held in the Mideast, and we haven't been able to counter that. In fact, every time we make an international spectacular out of that, or a lot of attention is focused on it, we actually give the terrorists what they want, and so it's a very difficult situation. If there had never been a word published in any paper in the whole world, I suppose, I don't know whether those people would still be there or not. So it's a very difficult situation. Now, you can't, I'm not taking the attitude of saying we shouldn't say anything about it. But are we into a different situation here? And I'd like to know what your views are. Are we more likely to get those people released in this changed world situation we find ourselves in? I believe there's some 16 hostages still held, 8 American and 8 of all the other nationalities put together. President Assad has been an ally of ours now. That's something new and different. Prime Minister Rafsanjani wants more contact with the West. Gaddafi says he's no longer using terrorism. Yet in Syria we find Ahmad Jabril's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the general command is still in Damascus. I think that could undoubtedly be controlled if Assad wanted to control it. Iran is, they still have control over radical Shiites who hold hostages in Lebanon apparently, or have a major influence on them, if not absolute control. In Libya, Abu Nidal still has a headquarters in Tripoli, or some rumors it may have relocated to Baghdad. And we don't know. What are the prospects on the hostages at this point? Can you tell us, Mr. Berquist, in light of this changed situation?
To further that shift, we engaged in a dialogue with the Syrian government in an effort to convince them that they need to modify their policies in regards to toleration of terrorist groups operating out of Damascus and out of the Syrian-controlled areas in Lebanon.
Are we making progress?
Well, as you're aware, dealing with the Syrians, they are a hard nut. But I believe that there are going to be ups and downs in that process, but we're going to be persistent and consistent.
But I take it at this time that there's no intention to take the Syrians off the terrorism list?
No, we have no intention.
And how about the Iranians? Any indication that they're prepared to act enough to take them off the terrorism list? No. Let's go back to Iraq. You know, during the war, there was a general sense that that just about every terrorist in the world was flocking to Baghdad for support and reinforcement. We've discussed now why we think more didn't happen of terrorist incidents, but nonetheless, I presume some of those groups are still there. What is the State Department's estimate at this point of the existence of terrorist organizations operating out of Baghdad or other points in Iraq?
We have indication that there are still a number of terrorist organizations that at least have offices and may have some combatant elements training in Iraq.
Can you name them?
The ones that you spoke of earlier, we believe are still there.
The May 15th organization with Ibrahim still there.
We believe it's difficult, and again, I'm speaking off the top of my head. I am not an intelligence specialist by any means, and sometimes tracking the movements of Arab terrorists is an involved process. But in general, I can say that those organizations you mentioned are still represented in Baghdad, mm-hmm. and there may be a degree of number of combatants there training, and there may also be a small A&O presence, but we don't know whether that's just a liaison office or what.
A small, which presence?
A&O.
Why don't you spell it out for the record?
Abu Nidal.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Well, how do you measure the threat level of revenge terrorist attacks by a defeated Saddam Hussein in the next year? Is that high, low, medium?
Right now, I think it's low because we still have the sanctions in place. And I believe that Saddam Hussein is going to continue to not undertake any activities which would slow the process of getting the sanctions, the UN sanctions off of Iraq taken off. After that happens, then clearly we're in a new era, and I would be speculating at that point.
Mr. Gallagher, was there any indication during the Persian Gulf crisis that organized anti-American groups, terrorist groups within our country, were seeking or had linkages with the Iraqi government?
No, Senator, we did not identify any activity associating any known terrorist entity within the United States with the Iraqi government. But if you look at the efforts by the United States government directed at not only the official Iraqi presence, but the Iraqi intelligence network inside the United States, from almost the beginning of the crisis, we took a very offensive mode towards Iraqi intelligence. Back in August of 1990, Iraqi Airways existed in 4 different locations around the United States. In August of 1990, those 4 offices were closed. I mentioned earlier a series of reductions at the Iraqi embassy, which culminated in January with the Iraqi embassy being closed and becoming an intersection. And throughout the United States, any known Iraqi intelligence offices were afforded extensive FBI coverage during the entire period of the Persian Gulf crisis. They just didn't have the ability to reach out to other either radical extremist groups.
Do any of the other state sponsors of terrorism that we've talked about this morning have contacts with domestic American political or terrorist groups, for instance, Syria or Libya?
Well, first of all, the director of the FBI has said publicly that there are Middle East terrorist infrastructures inside the United States.
Right.
There have in the past been indications of attempts by state sponsors of terrorism to establish contacts with domestic or our own homegrown terrorist infrastructures inside the United States.
Would you estimate, Mr. Gallagher, at this point that the risk of an international terrorist incident occurring in the United States is greater or less now than it was during the war?
Certainly the intensity of the threat has lessened since the war, but I would not want to say that the terrorist threat will ever go away inside the United States. We are somewhat reassured by the fact that there has not been an international terrorism incident since 1983, but as we look at the changing developments over in the Middle East, we have to remain alert for that possibility inside the United States.
To the best of your knowledge, looking backward again, did American diplomacy in the Iran-Iraq war ever impede the FBI in its pursuit of Iraqi-related terrorists, either here or abroad?
Not for a second, Senator. During the Persian Gulf crisis, I think as a tribute to the United States government, there was outstanding cooperation, communication, and coordination at every phase of our counterterrorism program. The United States government's counterterrorism program is very much of a multifaceted program that demands and commands close coordination and communication, and it received that during the Persian Gulf crisis.
We're running on in time, but I do want to ask you just briefly, if you could. We've been focused here on domestic terrorism in your case during the war, and the threat level from internationally related terrorist episodes here in the U.S. now. How would you gauge, or would you describe for a moment, the threat of terrorism that is more domestically based? You indicated that most of the terrorist incidents that have occurred here over the last several years have been related to Puerto Rican situation. What else do you measure as the most serious domestic terrorist threats to the U.S. at this time?
Well, correctly you cited the figure of Puerto Rican-related terrorism. That's responsible for over 60% of the terrorist incidents during the past 5 years inside the United States. If you were to go beyond Puerto Rican terrorism in the arena of domestic terrorism, we'd have to look at the prospects of environmental terrorism. During the past few years, there has been, and just to typify the potential, there has been a series of bombings.
Ambassador Bremer was the former ambassador at large for counterterrorism and crisis management in the State Department. Mr. Koch was the former director of special planning, among other things, for the U.S. Department of Defense. Just to show the continuing high level of cooperation between the State and Defense Departments, at least in these matters, I gather that Mr. Koch has agreed that because Mr. Bremer has been good enough to rearrange his schedule to wait longer than I know he really originally wanted to, and still has to rush back to New York, that we will hear his testimony, and then I'll ask you some questions, and then we'll go to Mr. Koch and I'll ask him some questions. Thanks very much, Ambassador, for being here. I look forward to your testimony now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your permission, I'd like to ask that my full text be entered into the record.
It will be printed in the record.
I might just summarize briefly the key points. It's a pleasure to be here. Mr. Chairman, as I said in my testimony, I think it's a good idea for the committee to focus on this matter when we're not under the immediate threat of a terrorist incident, which is usually when this problem gets attention. I guess my message in my testimony is there's good news and bad news, and the good news slightly outweighs the bad news. The good news is that under American leadership over the last decade, the West has come up with a strategy to combat terrorism, which has as its basic principle that terrorists are criminals. They commit criminal acts. We have, as a society of laws to deal with criminal acts, and those laws should be brought to bear on terrorists here and abroad. We have also found that it's important to give the agencies who are responsible for combating terrorism the tools to do that job, whether they're intelligence agencies, Defense Department, Justice Department, Border Patrol, the INS, and so forth. And finally, the final element of the strategy is to recognize that certain states have used terrorism as part of their foreign policy and that that's unacceptable. Now, it seems to me the good news is that in the past decade, cooperation to fight terrorism has increased dramatically, both among government agencies in the American government, and you've heard a bit about that this morning already, and between the United States and other countries. And I think that that cooperation goes a long way to explaining why there was so little spectacular terrorism during the Gulf crisis and the subsequent Gulf War. That pattern of cooperation and reacting to threats, it seems to me, was crucial to keeping the terrorist threat to a manageable level during that crisis. Now, the bad news is I think we can't afford to be complacent. There are threats still out there ahead of us. For one thing, terrorists will certainly have access to high technology. We've already seen very long time delay fuses used by the IRA. We've seen laser scanners used by the Baader-Meinhof gang in their assassination of the German banker Herrhausen 2 years ago. And there is always the possibility that the terrorists will get their hands on nuclear, biological, or chemical agents and use those in terrorism. Which brings me then to my final point, which is how important it is, I think, Senator, for the American Congress to continue to support the administration's research and development in this area. There is a small, as you know, interagency program chaired by the State Department which looks into the areas of counterterrorism research which are not being looked at by other agencies. It has been a very successful program. It has been comprehensively underfunded by the American Congress over the last 5 years. Congressional appropriations are less than half of the administration's request, though I'm glad to say in fiscal 91 the full amount requested was appropriated. So I think, Senator, we have some policies in place that can help us work. We've got to stay the course, and we need to keep putting some money into the effort.
Thank you very much. Let's begin by going back, and I'll ask you the same question I asked the earlier witness. Looking back, do you think it was a mistake for us to have taken the Iraqis off the terrorism list during the early 80s?
It's a very hard question to answer. I think probably we have to start by saying, what is the purpose of the terrorism list? The purpose is as a tool of diplomacy to try to get the country involved to change its behavior. In the early 1980s, the major concern I gather that we had with Iraqi support for terrorism was the presence of the headquarters of the Abu Nidal organization in Baghdad.
Right.
Under prodding from the American government and others, the Iraqi government in 1982 did expel the Abu Nidal organization from Baghdad, and he moved his headquarters subsequently to Damascus. And I gather as part of the calculation that went into it then, we said, well, he's at least moving in the right direction. We ought to recognize that, and they took him off the list. I think it's a kind of a close call. You do want to use this list in a way that encourages the kind of behavior you're trying to have. Obviously, Iraq is now back on the list where it belongs.
Go into a little more detail, if you would now, Ambassador, about why you think that we were not victims of more spectacular terrorist incidents during the Gulf War.
I think the most important thing was the very vigorous international reaction to the threat of terrorism. All around the world, countries took the kind of precautions we know upset terrorists. We started defending buildings, we increased the security at airports, we looked out for airlines, we increased security at hotels and railroad stations. We know from captured terrorists that any time there's any change, even a minor change in the security arrangements around a target building or person, it upsets their plans. Secondly, the very large-scale pressure that was brought to bear on potential terrorist sympathizers in Europe in particular undoubtedly disrupted planned terrorist attacks there, in my view. I think there's no question.
What kind of pressure was that?
Well, for example, in France, in Italy, and in Britain, a large number of suspected terrorist sympathizers were brought under arrest or detention. Their laws are more lax than ours in that respect. They're able to keep people in France, for example, for up to 7 days, I think, without charging them.
That was a form of preventive detention there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of measure, while it's not possible under our law, nonetheless, it certainly had an effect on terrorists' operations in Europe, I think.
You know, your answer here reminds me of something that I know we all know, but it's worth saying anytime we talk about terrorism, that terrorists tend not to be heroes, not to be courageous. They tend to strike at soft spots, undefended spots, weak points, so that to the extent that the acts that you described, the defensive acts that you described, and were described by the earlier panel, made it more difficult to have an easy shot, it obviously also diminished the prospects for terrorism. How do you evaluate the statement by Mr. Berquist that some of the well-known terrorist groups, including those who were affiliated more directly with Iraq during the war, may have made a judgment that Saddam was the loser and they didn't want to take action that seemed to be supportive of his position?
It's possible. I think it's a little risky to start trying to put ourselves into the minds of the terrorist groups. We just don't know enough about them. I think it's more likely that the countermeasures that were put into effect provided the deterrent.
I understand that you're not inside the government now, but that you follow these matters closely. How would you evaluate the threat level at this point from Iraqi-sponsored terrorism?
Well, I think the Iraqis' direct ability to conduct terrorism has been somewhat exaggerated in the past year. If you look at Iraqi terrorism over the last 12 years, it's essentially been very good at one thing, which is assassinating Iraqi dissidents, individual dissidents, usually overseas, of course also in Iraq.
Right.
They have not had much of a capacity to conduct what we think of as large-scale terrorist spectaculars, but they can always subcontract those, and I think we should be on the alert for this. No doubt Saddam would like to get some revenge, and if he could get that revenge by subcontracting it to a terrorist group, I think he probably would try.
Do you have any knowledge of the existence of those groups that went allegedly to Baghdad during the war, as to whether they're still there? I gather that there's some indication that Abu Nidal is back in Baghdad.
I don't know where he is right now, Senator. I believe most of his operations and operatives, however, are still in Libya.
Do you think that our government should have been more aggressive in pursuing terrorists allied with Iraq, such as Mohammed Rashid, during the period before the war? Again, that's a question of learning from history, certainly the history of our relations with Iraq during the earlier 80s. Let me ask you this question. The Soviet Union is in decline. The United States, the one superpower. We lead the effort in the Persian Gulf War. We win the war. We're dominant in a strategic sense, security sense in the world today. Is it foolish to think that just as nations that have been hostile toward us in the past seem at least to be attempting to curry up to us, that the terrorists themselves might see less to gain from their normal pattern of behavior?
Let me just speculate on that. I think looking at terrorism straight on, it would be very difficult to propound a theory of the utility of terrorism. We've had to endure a great deal of it in the post-67 period. There's been a tremendous amount of bloodshed, tremendous amount of attention paid to this, and there's no evidence that it works. And so why you would persist in it at all, it seems to me.
No evidence that it works to change policy.
I'm sorry.
In other words, no evidence that it works to change policy.
It doesn't change policy.
Right.
It doesn't. It tends to aggravate people more than anything else,
right,
and make them more stiff-necked about their approach to the problems that the terrorists are trying to solve. So
even though it works in the sense that people have been killed and a lot of blood, as you've said, as well.
Correctly, it causes an awful lot of heartache and things of this nature, and it causes a lot of temporary confusion and upheaval in the United States, where we have very little of it to contend with in the first place.
Right.
Occasionally, it may vex our relations with our allies, but it's temporary. But at the end of the day, the question of do we have a homeland, do we have anarchy in Germany, do we have an enclave in the Pyrenees, the answer is consistently no. It doesn't work. And so I just preface this by, with that observation by saying what's different now? Why should they say because the Soviet Union has collapsed and the United States appears to be paramount in the world, should we just fold our umbrellas and go home? I think one of the things, if I may say, a result of the collapse of Eastern Europe is to create a great number of new problems for us in the security area to set loose a lot of talent in these secret police, state police that are now discredited, have no place to go, no jobs. These are the true believers. What do you do with them? These are the people that know how to conduct surveillance, that know how to build bombs, that know how to carry out assassinations, and more than that know a lot about American and Western allied security doctrine and dealing in these areas. So I expect to see a threat come from that quarter, and we're already seeing not specifically terrorism, but great increases in the crime rates both in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. The number of bank robberies in Western Germany has doubled, has been as high last year as it had been from the period from the end of World War II until last year.
And you think that that might be related to security forces or
well, it's more related to the fact that in Eastern Europe there was never a need for organized police forces.
Yeah.
These people don't know how to investigate a murder, to investigate a bank robbery. Nobody robbed banks in East Germany because they didn't have anything in them, or what they had in them wasn't worth anything in the first place. So why would you do it? And so it's the problems of this sort that now it's virtual anarchy, and some of this is spilling over into Western Europe, puts additional pressure on Western European enforcement and intelligence agencies. That's going to be a problem.
What are your reactions to the latest evidence which seems to implicate Libya in the Pan Am 103 bombing?
Well, I'm not sure. As the investigation of 103 has gone on, the number of theories have proliferated, the number of charlatans that have gotten themselves insinuated into the game has grown. The number of people who are on consultancies to various news organizations with a theory or a variety of theories to fit the day or the audience has really muddied the water very substantially in this thing. Now, none of this is to say that there's not a Libyan involvement. There does seem to be some forensic evidence to suggest that there is. To say that that's conclusive, to say the fact that this shows that Libya was involved in it is not as clear. Libya over the last decade and before has gotten itself into the market for every weapon, every toy, every gimmick, from Czechoslovakia to China to the CIA, and they've just warehoused this junk. As I said in my testimony, their inventory control procedures are not quite in it with Kmart. This stuff slips out again, and to say that because we find a device that we can trace to Libya, that links Libya automatically to that event is far-fetched as saying that because they use Semtex that the government of Czechoslovakia was responsible for it, or because a bomb that was used in India used C4 that the United States government was behind it. We're making leaps of faith here. The Libyan association comes to us from French intelligence. Not through anything of our own, and the question really is, do the French have any fish to fry in this matter? They want us to pay more attention to what happened in Chad with the UTA bombing, and so I don't exclude or discount the possibility of Libyan involvement, but I don't think that what troubles me about it is that it's been seized on in many quarters of our own government as a way of exonerating. I saw one newspaper report that says, well, this completely exonerates Syria.
Yeah, and that's important that the source of this is the French.
Right.
And you're obviously not prepared to exonerate Syria or Iran at this point from involvement in 103.
That's correct.
Let's talk a little bit about the domestic terrorist threat here in the United States. How do you evaluate it at this point?
I don't evaluate it as in terms of a threat to the Commonwealth. It's not in it with the proliferation of weapons. It's in everybody's hands. It's not in it with street crime and with drug crimes and drug-related crimes. In terms of the numbers of fatalities that it creates and presents us with. On the other hand, there's a disturbing aspect to this that may be more important than all these phenomena that create these high fatalities. In special interest or single interest terrorism, we see people who object to paying their taxes involved in this. We see people who are on both sides of the abortion question, willing to kill people on the opposite side of that question. We see the environmental movement, which was mentioned earlier in testimony. The people who will go into a logging area and drive spikes into a tree, and then somebody comes along to log that out, and the saw hits that, breaks, and it can decapitate you. So this is serious. The animal rights business, the Animal Liberation Front that Mr. Gallagher mentioned earlier, is carried by the FBI as a terrorist group. It's an international organization, and it's a very shadowy organization. The people who engage in this thing are not the sort of folks you have in your mind, if you have someone in your mind when you think of who's involved with the Abu Nidal Association or PFLP or so. These people are yuppies. These people drive Volvo station wagons. These people have good jobs. They're accountants. They're lawyers. They have children. They have good educations, and they'll go out on a weekend or for the 2 or 3 hours that it takes to plant an incendiary bomb in a clinic somewhere, and then drive back home. They're very difficult to find. The reason I say that this is something that troubles us enormously is because it suggests a falling away from a commitment to a consensus of what we are as a people. We may not like all the laws, but we sort of obey all the laws because we've come to them through a process that we all agree on, a political process, an election process. And this is what comes out the other end, and we say, well, I don't like it, but I'm an American, I accept it. These people don't accept it. And as we have more of this sort of activity, I don't think it's going to be any more effective than broader gauge terrorism in the world is going to be. Having said that, I have to tell you that the animal rights people have had a tremendous impact on the fur industry, have virtually gutted the fur industry. They've had a tremendous effect on the cosmetics industry. And it's interesting to see the market come into play here, where they force them to stop using animals to test for the Dre's test, where they put the chemicals in rabbits' eyes and things like that. And now cosmetics companies are shifting away from doing that. They're using tissue samples and computer runs and things like that, and that's where the money is going in this business. So to that extent, that kind of terrorism has been effective. Now they're going after medical testing and food itself.
Are we doing a good enough job in defending ourselves against those forms of domestic terrorism? In other words, the FBI is generally in charge of that for us. Are they doing a decent job?
Well, sir, the FBI, like any organization, operates with constrained resources. It has to go after the things. It's chasing spies, it's chasing bank robbers and things of this sort. And so this is not a matter of paramount importance either to them or, in most cases, to the victims. The food industry, the pork producers, the meat people, they don't, this annoys them, but it's not something they take all that seriously. And so I think while the FBI has some assets dedicated to this, and since the problem itself is, you can get your hands around some parts of it and produce some apparent successes fairly quickly, the tendency is to try to do that. But I think at this stage of the game, it's an embryonic problem. It's going to grow in the years to come. It's one that people don't know a great deal about. I would say with some pride and satisfaction that I think the country's leading expert on this is a man named Glenn Schoon, who is the chief of our analytical services at ISM. Other than that, there's casual interest, but there's not a great deal of understanding of the problem.
How about the extent of coordination between the existing federal government agencies in combating domestic terrorism? From your experience, is it what it ought to be?
Well, the problem is not big enough to, it is what it ought to be. It's an FBI, terrorism in this country is a crime, pure and simple. Our law enforcement people are set to take care of it, and they do pretty effectively. We keep most of our problems out of the country. Our customs people, border police, and so forth. We keep this problem away from us, the way we try to keep every threat to this country